Yes, but I think, so I think it gets split. I mean, I think I do some and then UOL does some. I'm not entirely sure how this thing works out. But at the end of the day, it'll be marks lah. Chinda. Whether I mark or UL marker mark or what, the logic is the same, right? Because we all use the marking. Sorry, we all use the marking rubric, right? Maybe I'm stricter. How you know? Okay. All right, let's do our lesson today. All right, which is the final topic, right? Which is ICC. Okay. The logic with ICC, like I said, I already went through with you last week, right? The kinds of exam questions that you can expect to see with the ICC. So for those who if you haven't watched last week's video recording, or if you missed out on certain things, please go and check out last week's video recording, because I know I discussed at length, right? What are the potential questions that can come out for this particular chapter, right? Discussing ICC, ICTY, ICTR, right? The week before lah, ayo Rain. The week before, I mean the previous lecture, the one on ICTY and ICTR. Last week was Chinese New Year, I didn't see all right. Right. It's the previous lecture, the ICTY, ICTR. I discussed the exam the types of exam questions. Okay. In that session. That means this is lecture 20, right? Lecture 19. Okay, the most important thing that you need to remember are the fundamental differences. I mean, let me just say it right now, okay, and then maybe you all want to write this down, right? And then, then we can go on with the material, right? The most fundamental difference between ICTY and ICTR versus the ICC. That is how basically you look at it. ICTY, ICTR on one hand versus ICC on the other hand, right? Very rarely it's a comparison between ICTY and ICTR, right? Because those two are the tribunals that basically kicked off the entire process of establishing an international organization uh, dedicated to addressing crimes against humanity. Right? So it's always ICTY, ICTR on one hand versus ICC. So basically, what you want to be able to explain, right, very clearly in your exam answer, that means this is like a must explain kind, like a must have in your exam answer is fundamental themes. Number one, U.S. opposition, right? So U.S. opposition and U.S. resistance to the ICC, okay? How it is not a state party, right? And therefore that brings about a whole host of issues relating to the functionality of the ICC. Number one. Number two, it also calls into question the ability of the ICC to effectively carry out its investigations, right? Without attracting criticism, in the sense that there's always going to be a question: why is it that the why is it that what is that the crimes, right, that the US has um, conducted or engaged in, right, how come that has not been taken into account, right? And all of that has slowly changed because an investigation has been opened up subsequently, right, after during the last part of Trump's regime, right, and subsequently after now that Biden is in the picture, that has opened up they've opened up an investigation, right? So that is one thing, right? US opposition. Second thing that you need to pay attention to would be the logic of the ability of the ICC to cast its judicial net, right? So it is a permanent organization, right? Temptation to call it institution. It is a permanent organization, right? Unlike the ad hoc nature of ICTY and ICTR, right? Sorry. So um, the fact that it is permanent makes it, number one, more threatening, more number two, more imposing, right? And that basically, makes it more effective in the sense that it is able to try crimes against humanity across a longer period of time. Right? And it also, of course, is able to try crimes, across a whole host of different states, right, across the world. Either, if they're state parties, or either via reference of the United Nations Security Council, right? And related to that, as a result of its permanence and its ability to cast the judicial net wider, you have the principle of complementarity. That is what is, I will explain that, right? Okay, the principle of complementarity, it's in the lecture notes. All right, okay, I'll just write it for you. Complementarity. All right, principle of complementarity, where they deliberately, right, ensure that the ICC will function as a complement to the domestic legal system, rather than function in a way that it is more powerful, right, than and has got, powers or jurisdiction over and above the domestic legal system. So if state parties, right, and the domestic legal system are not willing to cooperate, right? Like, what, in the case like what we see with Sudan and Omar al-Bashir, right, who is still considered to be at large, despite having, two different arrest warrants on his head by the ICC, right? So if states are unwilling to cooperate or to compromise, right, then there's little that the ICC can basically do, right? So that is another issue that, you need to ensure that is inside your exam answer, because this has basically affected the effectiveness, uh negatively. Okay, let me rephrase that. This has negatively impacted on the effectiveness of the ICC, right? Because, it doesn't have authority or power over and above, right, the domestic courts. Highly reliant on the states. Another thing that you need to also pay attention to, right, is that there have been states that have withdrawn from the ICC, meaning that they sign the treaty, they ratify it, and they become state party. They become members of the ICC, so they're referred to as state parties, right? And for whatever reason, especially, when they find that they find themselves under investigation by the ICC, right, they uh, withdraw from the ICC. The Philippines is one, right? Burundi is another one. These two states have actually withdrawn from the ICC. I've given you the details also. So what happens in the case of the withdrawal, right? Okay, is that when they withdraw from the ICC and investigation has already been opened up, or investigation is subsequently opened up by way of referral, of the UN Security Council, right? What happens is that the scope of the investigation, right, and what they can, that means how the period in which they can actually investigate the purported or alleged crimes of against humanity, right, that has to occur within the period that they are the state parties, right? So in the case of the Philippines, if you look at it, I'm giving you the date, right, in the slide, all right. In the case of the Philippines, I think the date where they can investigate into the crimes against humanity, because that one was about over Duterte's war on drugs, right? And then, that uh, took on a very authoritarian, very harsh, tone, and therefore, investigation was launched into the way the way the war on drugs was actually conducted in the Philippines. So, until the period that they were a state party of the ICC, that is that is the period where they can, have the investigation. So around 2017, because I think it was in 2017 where they actually withdrew from the ICC, right? Okay, so that is another thing that you need to pay attention to. So there are a lot of technicalities that sorry, there are a lot of technicalities that are involved, right, in terms of how when a state sorry, how and when the ICC can open up an investigation, and that adds on to our overall assessment as to whether it is effective or not. So again, the logic here is that there have been a lot of criticisms leveled against the ICC. There are a lot of questions about whether it is effective or not. Right, I've got a couple of I've got a lot of links for you, like URL, video, and everything for you inside the lecture notes. Right, I've also I intend to watch one or two of the videos with you today if we have time. Right, but this is basically please take a look at all the updates that I've given you. Right, it's always important. I had some students ask, is like the year one students who ask, like, oh, is it okay to use the material from the subject guide, and the like the examples and the illustrations from the subject guide and so on. My answer is yes, it's fine, right? I always say there's no shame in referring to certain phrases or, certain examples or illustrations and so on from the subject guide. But the logic, because there are certain things that are classic, you cannot run away from them because they are emblematic of what the topic is about. But at the same time, right, there must be a reflection of the student having done the readings, right? So you've got all the readings. I've summarized a lot of the readings for you. From Kant's Means and Styles and Armstrong, Whitman and Lloyd and Hurd and whatever into the lecture notes. I've used a lot of Kant's Means and Styles, and I've also looked at a lot of additional external material like media articles and videos and so on. All of this is useful because these are updates, right? You cannot go to the exam just looking at the material in your subject guide, because those, I mean, it is somewhat dated, right? And you cannot just like rely only on the subject guide. I want to emphasize this because I there was one particular uh exam script that I saw, final exam script. Student sent it to me lah, and it was basically like statements by this statements, and then after that subsequently it was like chunks of material taken from the subject guide, and in quotes, but it's all from the subject guide, and it didn't fare well, right? So the logic is that you cannot have an over heavy reliance, right, on the subject guide. Although it's far more summarized than the lecture notes. Again, lecture notes have got a lot of details in it, so please be careful, right, how you are referring to the material, what you're using, right? I will always recommend make sure that you include, even if you don't include all those other media articles and things that I've given you, right, you have to make reference to Kant's Means and Styles and the recommended texts, because that is part of the syllabus, right? So I want to remind you, this, since it's the literally the second last lecture before your prelims. Next week I will do like a conclusion kind of lecture, right, with like a summary of the themes and the ideas that you must know for your exam. Then your revision, the local revisions, right? I don't know whether when, if you all have UK revisions and when that will be, right? But the local revisions, I'll run through the tougher questions from the prelim papers. There's usually what I do, and then some of the other must know themes, or like a recap of some of the important ideas in your for the course, right? So that's basically what is the remainder lah, right? Okay, how we will do the revision lectures and so on. Okay, all right. So the exam question angles for this topic, right, like what I highlighted to you already, is the state's acceptance, and approach, to the ICC, right? Which are the states who are willing, which are the states that tend to sorry, which are the states that tend to express a reservation of the ICC. Why are they suspicious of it? Why is there opposition to it? Like China, right? Why does it have opposition to the ICC? Why does the US have opposition to the ICC and so on, right? Effectiveness, right, vis-a-vis the powers of ICTY ICTR. That means looking at the principle of complementarity in the Rome Statute, right? The African bias of the ICC. I definitely want to watch that video with you. It's a short video, right? But basically, the video highlights, the idea of the the but inherent supposed inherent bias, right? Basically, if you look at all the different investigations, right? Uh, if you look at what countries the investigations are based in, the majority do unfortunately happen to be African states. So the African, states and the AU tend to ask, where is the white man in the investigations? How come it's only us that is being investigated, right? So that is one question that they do tend to ask. Fatu Bensouda, who is the previous chief prosecutor, the chief prosecutor is now Karim. I cannot remember his full name. He's a lawyer. He's a British lawyer. Karim Khan, right? Karim Khan. Karim Khan is the current chief prosecutor, but the previous chief prosecutor, who was in each of the chief prosecutors are in place in that position for 9 years, right? And Fatou Bensouda, basically came out to say no, and she's from Gambia, right? And basically she said, no, there is actually no real bias, right, of the ICC, but she's coming from it, as a representative of the organization. But the 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 African states, see it in a slightly different way. So your job is to, make a comment, right? To say, do you think it's actually valid, right? Or it just so happens to be, right, that a lot of crimes against humanity happen to occur on African soil or in the African continent, right? And it so happens to be a trend, but it is not an obvious targeting of African states per se, right? Okay, so that is how you need to balance the argument. I'll come to that discussion in a while, right? And then of course finally, how does the ICC contribute, if at all, do you think, right, to the strengthening of the international of international law? I would say definitely it does, right? There's no doubt about it. The extent to which it contributes to the strengthening of the law, that is something that, sorry, need to push something away. That is something that you can argue on, right? But I think there's no doubt that yes, it does contribute to the strengthening of international law. It doesn't contribute to the strengthening of international law if it is not significant at all. Why are states so scared of it? All right, simple common sense. Please don't write scared of it in the exam, but it's simple common sense answer, right? If it was not powerful at all, right, then why would they rush to withdraw from the ICC? Number one, it wasn't powerful at all if it doesn't contribute to the strengthening of international law by upholding. That is the idea down here. When you say strengthening of international law, what do you mean by strengthening? Can you please write that down? Because I think students don't think carefully enough about this point. When you say strengthening of the law, right? How do you strengthen the law? What do you mean by strengthening of the law? Making it more effective? Interpreting the law more frequently? Has it to do with um, ensuring that more cases are brought under the radar of the ICC? That means every single case that is a crime against humanity is picked up, right, and is addressed via the ICC, right? So what does strengthening of international law mean? Does it mean institutionalization and according more powers to the ICC to allow them to cast their judicial net wider, further, stronger, in a stronger manner? Right. So these are the ways that you need to interpret the idea of strengthening of international law, as opposed to a student who just repeatedly says strengthening international law, right, in the exam answer, but doesn't actually explain what is strengthening international law or what does that entail. How do you answer a question, right, on strengthening international law without in the first place explaining what is the interpretation of it? Right. So I think this is a fundamental mistake. The first fundamental mistake that everyone makes when they answer, these kinds of exam questions, or when they answer exam questions in general, there's no interpretation of what the question is asking you for, or no interpretation of what the keyword in the question is. It's just a repetition, throughout. And they feel that they've addressed the question. Yeah, they've addressed the question somewhat, right? But it doesn't show that you have any insight into what it actually means, right? So, like, just like how, if you say, oh, the EU has become more powerful, then, repeatedly, the EU is more powerful, the EU is more powerful. How is it more powerful? Why is it more powerful? What tells you that it is more powerful? That is the fundamental mistake that everybody makes. Please write this down somewhere, right? And remind yourself, right, that this is what you need to address. You need to interpret what the question is asking you for. Sometimes you need to challenge, right, what the question is asking you for, right? In the first place, that means when you say, how does the ICC contribute to strengthening of international law, right? Does it even contribute to the strengthening of international law? That's why I have got the if at all, right? And that is what it means to challenge, the exam answer. You understand the logic now here? All right, okay. All right. Okay, let's move on. Yeah, this first video, I think I won't watch with y'all. I opened it, but I won't watch it. Please watch it on your own. The second one, please watch it. It's a long video, all right? But it is useful, right? Because this will go towards helping you to gain a perspective, right, on that evaluation, right, as to whether the ICC is relevant, how is it strong or not strong, and so on, right? And the logic is where he examines is a bit dated. Yeah, I know it's 2017, from a couple of years ago, but it still addresses the main framework, right? It's about the logic of, is the ICC really a threat to state sovereignty, right? Because of the ability to try the crimes, right? So remember that question that we always ask, at what point does a state um, does a state lose its privilege of saying that I'm sovereign, right? And therefore you cannot intervene in the domestic affairs of my state. That's basically what states who are opposed to the ICC. That's basically the argument, right? It is my state. It is the domestic affairs of my state. How I treat my citizens is my business, right? The citizens that I am targeting, according to you, right, that means international community, I'm treating them unfairly. But according to me, I have little choice but to treat them in this way because they are basically a stumbling block to law and order, right? So it's an interpretation of the state, right? And they can, of course, in their defense, they can interpret, it any way they want, right? So the logic is that, is the ICC indeed, can it be considered or perceived as a threat to state sovereignty, right? How does the international community see the ICC vis-a-vis how individual states see the ICC as a threat to their state sovereignty, right? And whether the ICC is basically given a task that is impossible, right? Is it an impossible mission, right? That means the pursuit of global justice. The very fact that it is global in nature, right? Go back to the argument. Maybe I'm gonna write this down, right? Go back to the argument of what fundamentally is the function of international organizations, right? And the logic is that how does the ICC fit into this rubric of functions of international organizations, right? So, what are the duties or functions of international organization? A platform for interaction, an expression of global governance. It is about multilateralism, right? It is about states wanting to cooperate. It is about reiteration of norms, principles, and practices, right? Often, and then you've got the criticisms of international organizations, right? Are they vehicles or faces of great powers? right? Of course, in this case, the ICC is definitely not a vehicle of great power because the superpower, the global superpower, is not a member and not state party of the ICC, and actually, has expressed reservation, and that does it work counterproductively, right? The fact that the US, which is a global superpower, is not part of this international organization, right? Does that actually signal to other states, right? Because the logic is that when you have a superpower, right, fundamental IR concept, right? When you have a superpower, and the superpower is a representation of particular norms, practices, and principles, right? And then what you do see subsequently is other states, right, who embrace or embody similar practices, principles, norms that the superpower embraces and embodies. Because that is like the idea of bandwagoning in the sense that if democracy, right, example, right, if democracy is a practice, principle, or norm that is something that the superpower upholds and embodies, then other states want to take advantage of the various institutions that and organizations and structures that tie in with the idea of democracy. If they are opposed to these institutions, they're opposed to these norms, then they are then considered to be outside the structure, right? So when they embody the same structures, right, then they have a more advantageous edge over other states that are outside of the structure, right? Because they are all following the same norms, practices, and principles, right? You understand this logic, right? So the rationale is that how does this argument then fit in, with looking at the ICC and then looking at the US? Okay, all right. Uh, I would say that maybe the US opposition to ICC, has become a little bit better following Trump's exit, right? But it hasn't come to a point where we say that yeah, the US is going to be a state party and it's going to be a member and so on. Okay, all right. Okay, so let's look at this one down here. All right, the origins, right? I will maybe take a bit look at the video later. All right. The ICC basically came about in Rome at the International Conference 1998, right? There was a lot of bargaining, negotiations, on the design, on the or jurisdictional reach, right? Okay. And the rationale about the bargaining and the negotiations, right, is largely to do with the fact that it is a permanent court. If it was like an ad hoc tribunal like ICTY ICTR, you would not have seen the extent of negotiations because once these are agreed upon and they form the charter or the founding document, right, then these become more difficult to wheedle their way out of, right? So that is the rationale down here. That's why there's a lot of negotiations, there's a lot of bargaining, right? And states want to ensure that that it's like a push and pull at the same time. States want an organization that is going to be able to address all of these transgressions, right? But the rationale is that they also want an organization that's not going to hurt them in the long run. So states basically at the end of the day, right, they are wearing their realist lenses, ironically, while engaging in negotiations, for a liberalist kind of an organization, right? In the true spirit of liberalism, where they want to come together to have a framework for global governance and multilateralism, but they're still wearing their realist lenses. So eventually, 60 states ratified the Rome Statute, right, of the ICC. ICC became operational in July 2002. Okay, all right. So 60 states, it's like literally half, right? Or less than half of the total number of states in the whole world, right? That's number one. Number two, even from these 60, you've got others who have come in subsequently, yes, but you've also got a bunch of states who have exited from the ICC as well, so quite problematic, right? This one very important, all right. I will come back to this idea at the end of the lecture when we look at Obama. When we look at Biden and Trump, right? It's in the lecture notes for you. But please make sure that you find a way to address it in your exam answer. The last batches, right, I did notice students who did arguments on ICC did not really address the US opposition. That means it was probably mentioned in a line, right? But there was no explanation, right? Which I feel does not address the issue of US opposition and how severe it actually is. Okay, so please make sure that you discuss it in detail. All right. So when you look at US opposition, right, basically, why did they oppose, right? Okay, they were basically unhappy about this because the logic is that they were afraid that that it would hold the US military and political leaders to a uniform global standard of justice, right? Because remember, all of these tribunals, war tribunals, and courts, criminal courts, right? They basically do not care about whether you are a foot soldier or whether you are president, right? As long as you have, you know, deemed, to have committed a crime against humanity, right? Genocide, war crime, torture, rape, all of these things, right? Then you are going to be held to this, standard of justice, right? So the logic here, right, is that uh, each of the various administrations, right, uh, they basically supported international accountability for war crimes, right? Particularly, in the era of the Clinton administration. And, why do you want to start off with the Clinton administration? Because if you look at IR, right, and you look at the role of the US, right, over the years, right, it was actually in the Clinton administration, that period, right, was when the US started to place itself more explicitly on a global platform, right? From the from the time of say for example World War II onwards, right? That's where you got the logic of the US basically functioning as the global superpower, right? And then of course the fall of the Soviet Union just cemented its position subsequently, right? As a superpower, it was basically the only power left, right? And it was only in the Clinton administration that you actually saw a more active pursuit, right, of this logic of global governance, right? There was a higher participation in international organizations, are wanting to participate in drivers of globalization and so on. So the Clinton administration, right, is what started off, the support of international accountability for war crimes, right, and therefore you saw that it participated actively in negotiations, right, of the ICC treaty, and they were basically looking at Security Council screening of the cases and so on. And remember, who's a member of the P5, the US also, right? So if there was Security Council screening of the cases, right, then the US would have been able to veto, right, any kind of cases that comes in, that basically would if it's seen as a threat to its interest, right? So subsequently they eventually campaigned to weaken, undermine the court. Same thing with Bush administration, right? Very active opposition, right? And they wanted to ensure immunity of US nationals, right? But look at the time period also. Bush administration, you know, uh, what what was significant during the Bush administration, basically following Clinton, right? What was the significance of or what was significance of the time period of the Bush administration? What was it? Anybody? Bush, yeah, exactly. 9/11. Right. So, basically 9/11, and then, the subsequent war on terror, right? And the occupations, right, in Afghanistan and so on, right? Right. And so that's the logic down here, right? So, they were very actively opposed to it, right? And they were constantly threatening to terminate economic aid, withdraw military assistance and so on. Obama administration slightly different, right? They had been seen to make greater efforts to engage with the ICC, provided a lot of support, but still, you did not see any kind of intention to join the ICC, right? Because still, the concern doesn't go away, right? Concerns basically is that the ICC would end up prosecuting US military personnel or even the president of the US, right, without the US approval, and basically self-interest, right? ICC, was depicted as being, an organization that it would infringe on sovereignty, right? And the US, right, as a global power, basically has got exceptional international responsibility. It's basically the guardian of the international system. That's how it positions itself, right? As a superpower, right? So the logic is that, since it's got this great exceptional international responsibility, right? Responsibility to the international community, responsibility to the world, right? Then it should make its military or civilian leaders immune from jurisdiction, right, of the ICC, right? So basically, what they, were thinking more along the lines of, right, was an international court that had powers that, depended on the approval of the UN Security Council, right, which obviously allows the US a veto, right? So that was the point. If I am part of something, right, but I constantly veto everything that comes my way, then what's the point of being part of it at all, right? So it doesn't really make sense in that case, right? Because it is a immediate dumbing down of the effectiveness of the ICC, right? You got to link this back, later to the what to Trump, and then later to Biden, right, which I've got for you at the end of the lecture notes, right? But all of this, the US opposition, please do not leave it out of your exam answer, because it's a critical point in in assessing the effectiveness or the credibility of the ICC, right? Ensuring that the US position on the ICC is a well documented example in the exam, right? That is something that you have to make sure that you do, okay? All right. Okay, the ILC, right, is basically like the foundation for all of these other tribunals, right, that came about, right? So basically the idea down here, right, is that when you look at the ILC, the International Law Commission, right, it's important because it shows that the ICC and the predecessors, the ICTY and the ICTR, right, they were actually not new, right? The ideas behind these kinds of organizations is not new, right? But what it does show you, right, is that you do have self-interest, right? A lack of commitment, a lack of conviction consistently dogs these kinds of projects, right? You see, it started off way back in 1872, but it was not successful, right? There was, the project, or the mooting of the project way back in 1872, right? Unsuccessful, right? And then subsequently, a lot of proposals are introduced. So what does that suggest? In 1872, they highlighted that, you need something like this. You need an organization like this, right? 2002, then only you have the ICC actually coming into force as in a permanent court, right? Even prior to that, also the other two were ad hoc, right? So the logic down here is that there are members of the international community who realize the importance of having, such a project, right? Because the logic is that crimes against humanity are not a 21st century invention. These are problems that have been occurring over the years, right? But there's not been any kind of real commitment because states are selfish, right? States basically are seeking to protect themselves, right? If you had the project, especially, say, for example, in the wake of the International Military Tribunals in 1946, and then subsequently when you've got the Genocide Convention in 1948, right? Where they wanted to create, law commission. Sorry, they wanted to create a penal tribunal, right? And they begin to study the possibility of the permanent court, right? If this had been done in the late 1940s, 1950s at least, right? The ICC would have been established back then. It would have had that many years of experience. It would have, many years to fine tune the project. It would have had many years to, fine tune the processes and so on. Now, you know, 2002 to 2022, it's only 20 years old, right? For the 20 years that, it has been in existence, with the amount of opposition that it has faced, right? It is, amazing that it has been able to at least try that many cases, right? And it has been able to draw the world's attention to crimes against humanity in that many different states as well. Had it actually been in place since the 1950s or the 1960s, had the IOC, and basically being able to push for a permanent court, right? Imagine sorry, imagine the amount of headway that would have been made, right? So that is, why I wanted to point out, the ILC to start off with. Okay, all right. Okay, so they attempted to draft all of these, statutes and everything, right? But the idea lay dormant for 40 years. Imagine if it had not lain dormant for 40 years, right? Then you would have basically been able to address far more crimes against humanity. Some people may say, would it actually have prevented? Remember, we talked about deterrence last week, right? So would it have actually been able to prevent a lot of, these other crimes against humanity from actually, occurring? Maybe had, the ICC been in place, right? Maybe, right, would you have seen the kinds of genocide that we've seen, right, in, say, Rwanda or Yugoslavia, for instance, right? Okay, so they made the recommendation, right, in 1994, right, already looking at the background of the wars in former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, right, based on that, right. And then subsequently, they started to think about how important, right, having a permanent court in this case would actually be, right. So that's basically how they resurrected the idea and put it into action. All right, okay. So that's what you basically need to think about. Okay, so what you need to then discuss, right, is that when they finally decided to have an international permanent court, right, then how did the states react to it? How did they bargain, right? So the logic is that you're looking at it from a perspective where it is an anomaly, right? Okay, so the rationale is that the institutional design, right, basically once they agree upon it, right, it imposes substantial sovereignty costs on your ICC state parties. Please remember that you want to say state parties when you refer to the member states, right? And the logic is that it was also openly opposed by the most powerful states in the international system, like US and China. See, for example, wait, hold on, wait 1 second. Let me just explain the China opposition. Just now, I explained the US opposition, right? Okay, so let me just explain the China opposition very quickly, right? Okay, so when you look at the China opposition to ICC, the US one is because we know, right? The logic was how they felt that they needed the immunity, right? Given the fact that they did extraordinary work of protecting communities according to them, protecting communities all over the world, right? As from the perspective of them being the global superpower, right? And in doing so, their adventures, right, in a lot of these states like Afghanistan and Iraq and so on, would come into question, right? The China opposition to ICC is slightly different question, right? China participated in the Rome process, that means the negotiation process, right? But they did not become a state party, meaning they did not ratify the treaty. Remember, I always highlight signing the treaty versus ratification of the treaty. Only when it is ratified then does it come into force, right? And then does it apply to the state, right? So it did not ratify, right? Their stance was that the text of the Rome Conference, right, violated the principles of state sovereignty, and it violated the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. Why? Because the logic is that, according to them, right, you are basically creating an organization that has the ability to impose obligations of the ICC, right, on countries that did not agree to be the state parties, right? So the engagement, of China basically had been on an ad hoc basis, right, case by case basis. They basically in 2011 they supported the UNSC referral of Libya, right, the Libya situation, right. But in 2014 they vetoed on the Syrian situation, right. So depending on what their loyalties are or what their foreign policy interest is, depending on who the allies are, who are the states, right, that that are being referred to, right, they will support or they will disagree, right. An interesting argument, right, on China's interest or role in IOs in general, especially those like the ICC, right. China is really, over the last couple of years, right, has come to realize, especially in the era of Trump, right, in Trump's era, when you started to see his high rate of complaints or over international organizations, and not wanting to be part of the international multilateral framework, citing reasons of cost, citing reasons of unfair treatment and so on, right. You'll notice that China realized the importance, right, of global governance, institutions, processes, right. So the logic is that it wanted to start to take that position or take that place, right, that the US seemed to have vacate on a global basis. So it started to play a very active role, right. And you saw that even with the coronavirus pandemic, right, subsequently the role that it started to play, in WHO. Some critics will say that its interest, in the WHO was, and in addressing the coronavirus pandemic, was basically, just because it wanted to deflect attention, right, away from the domestic situation, and deflect attention away from the fact that a lot of analysts and critics were pointing out that ground zero, right, was basically in China, in Wuhan, right. And then there was a lot of controversy associated with it, a lot of conspiracy theories associated with it. Don't want to go into that, but the logic is that they started to realize the position that they could capture, right. When, especially when you started to see the retreat or the decline of the US, but right, what you all and sorry, and why this is important is because the logic that has always been put forth when you discuss the logic of superpower, right. In order for a state to be considered as a superpower, what does it need? It needs both hard power as well as soft power. This combination of hard plus soft power is known as what? Anyone? Combination of hard, yep, correct, smart power. Thank you, Ping Yang. Right. So without, if it only has hard power, right, but it doesn't have enough soft power, then how will China be able to capture that position, right, on an international level? Because it doesn't have that smart power reach, correct, right? So that is the rationale down here. That is why you start to see China, right, wanting to play a larger role, right. But at the same time, what you also realize, right, is that it has it seemingly shows little interest, right, in expanding any kind of resources to organizations, right, that offer no direct benefit, right. So the idea is that what are the norms that it does subscribe to, right, is human rights, right, a norm that belongs to the normative regime. that is entirely in China's interest or not. And if that is not the case, then you would notice that there's this ad hoc or selective response, right, to these kinds of organizations. What is it is in its interest. So while it understands the importance of international organizations, and that in relation to how it can wield influence in the international organization to expand, number one, its sphere of influence, number two, to increase its reach on soft power, which then would make it more able to harness hard power and soft power, right, which is like what Ping mentioned, the logic of smart power, right. You would notice that there is still like a stumbling block to that. It's not in its interest if it doesn't fit with its other interests, or it doesn't it's not a norm that it tends to subscribe to. Then you notice that its response to it is slightly different. Okay, all right. So basically, the main question, right? So that's the China opposition, right? So you've got U.S. opposition, you've got China opposition. What you basically want to highlight, right, is the main question. What made other states agree to delegate sovereignty to a new, untested, unprecedented IO, right? And the logic is that how do you explain legislation, instance of successful legislation, right, to in the international political system, right, despite the opposition of two regional hegemons, right? China, Israel, and global hegemon, like which is the US, right? Or I would hesitate to call China and Israel hegemon, regional powers, lah, right? I would rather call them regional powers. I think Kant, Smith, and Stahl is the one that referred to them as regional hegemons. So I would more prefer to call them regional powers, right? Because they're not technically hegemons. But how is it that even though the US is not a party, even though China is not party, Israel has opposed to it and so on, right? How come you've got other states who are willing to be part of it? What makes other states, right, wanting to delegate their sovereignty in this case, right? Because by being a state party, you're basically saying, look, okay, anything that occurs on my soil, you have the right to investigate, right? Because and that is how we're interpreting the logic of delegating some sovereignty, right? It's not states giving up their sovereignty, right? I think giving up sovereignty versus delegating sovereignty are two different ways to look at it, right? So think of it. Think of the terms that you're using. Okay, so basically you're looking at a constructivist argument, right, based on the concept of persuasion. All right, so remember what the constructivist arguments basically are referring to, right? The logic of social influence, right? Persuasion, like what we saw under Alistair Ian Johnston. Remember, right? I thought the answer is X, but everybody said the answer is Y. Therefore, I also agree the answer is Y. That logic, right? So when you look at the logic of the negotiations, right, you saw that the middle powers, the NGOs, basically they shifted the range of legitimate arguments, they shifted the scope of possible outcomes, right? So what you did have, right, is that you had the coalition for the International Criminal Court, right? They basically called the coalition of the ICC, right? And what they did was they shared a lot of knowledge. They shared, they canvassed opinions. They shared, concerns, right, about all of, what are the stumbling blocks to the ICC. Basically, what they were doing, right, was that they were basically by sharing this information, right, raising awareness, highlighting to them what are the various concerns, how can we overcome these concerns, and so on, right. They basically were able to influence, right, the social constitution of interest. Remember, that's the whole phrase behind social constructivism, right? Social constructivism is about how states, they look at themselves and they look at other states, right? And they look at the environment that they are in. And it is not so much, their own identities and their own interests that eventually make them respond in the way that they do, right? But it is how their interests and their identities are shaped by the environment, by their interactions with other states. Remember, states will respond in a hostile manner, right, if they identify the environment and the other actors in the environment to be selfish, to be hostile, to be untrustworthy, and so on. But they will respond, right, in a more liberalist fashion. And when they realize that the environment is full of opportunities to cooperate, that's your fundamental understanding, of why, anarchy is what states make of it, by Alexander Wendt, remember, right? So the rationale down here, right, is that they're those that were participating in the negotiations, right, their identities were basically influenced by the interactions, right? So it was really about the logic of agreement, right, amongst all of these other states, right, despite opposition by the US and China. So by sharing knowledge and canvassing opinions and and concerns and so on, right, they were basically able to explain sorry, they were basically able to explain to all of the other states, right, why it is in their favor, right, to actually say yes to a permanent international court. How this would basically be something that would be for the greater good, right? So the priming of the international community, that means, you are prepping them, you are highlighting to them the importance, right, of an international court, right? That basically allowed several of these other states to come to an international agreement, despite the US and China not being part of it, despite them being expressing reservations, right? So that is something that basically want to highlight, right? So in the end it formed the logic here is that it formed the basis for the agreements, right? Subsequently, you will also realize that these negotiations and this understanding of the importance of an international criminal court and the extent of its jurisdiction also counterintuitively or ironically formed the basis of opposition of the rest of the states, right, to the International Criminal Court as well. Right? Because initially they realize, oh, it's for the greater good. Then they realize this greater good can actually be not so good for my state if I am one of those states that are guilty of guilty of crimes against humanity. So that's basically how it works both ways, lah, right? Okay. All right. So the establishment of the ICC, right? Okay, the commission adopted the draft text, right, and subsequently 2010, right, key juncture, right, because this is where you get the assembly of state parties, right, all of the states, who were state parties to the Rome Statute, right. This was established, right, because all major administrative decisions are all made, in the ASP, right. So by the time you had the swearing in, right, of the judges and the prosecutor in June 2003, right, the OTP, Office of the Prosecutor, right, which is the main office that conducts all the investigations, right, had already received about 500 communications about alleged international crimes. Came into force in 2002. 2003, you have the swearing in of the judges and prosecutors, right, and you already have 500 communications, like complaints, lodged about alleged international crimes. What does it tell you about the role that the ICC was actually required to play? Is basically just born. 500 communications come in, right? It tells you, right, that this was a project that was long overdue, right? No other IO had been in the position to do something to deter or prevent any of these crimes against humanity. There's no other organization or no other entity that is able to also alleviate international crime subsequently also, right? So what does it tell you? It tells you that the ICC as an IO is deemed to be an absolute significant necessity. If it was not important, if it was not significant, how did it accumulate 500 communications in just that 1 year, right? The very fact that it is a new organization, right, and that accumulates 500 communications, it suggests to you that even before it has shown itself to be effective, there are already states investing faith in it, right? You wouldn't lodge a complaint or a or send a communication to the organization if you didn't think that it could do anything, right? Correct. So that itself is an indicator, right, of how, number one, long overdue the project was, right? Started off negotiations in the 1800s, like what we saw at the ILC and so on, right? And how states were basically just waiting, right? And it also tells you one very important thing: the appalling state of human rights in the international system, right? That is another major issue that you want to consider. Why do states basically transgress on citizens' human rights? Okay, all right. Let's take the break here. All right, before we do the next section. All right. So I will take it as what's the time? 1:10. What's that? It's 1:19 on my phone. It's 1:08 on the computer. Okay, come back. I'll take it as 1:10 lah. Okay, come back by 1:25. Okay, okay, break. Okay, come back by 1:25. All right.